Steve Harvey has stood behind the Family Feud podium long enough to think he has seen every kind of secret a family can carry onto a stage. He has seen financial secrets, romantic secrets, and family grudges that exploded under the studio lights. But on an October evening in 2026, a wife destroyed her husband's entire secret life on national television, and the secret was not an affair. It was worse. It was an identity. The man she had been married to for 16 years did not exist. His name was not real. His career was not real. His past was not real. And when she laid every piece of fabricated identity on the Family Feud podium like exhibits in a trial, Steve Harvey stood 3 feet away and said something he had never said in his entire career. He said, "I do not know what to say." Steve Harvey, the man who always has something to say, was rendered speechless. Because some lies are so vast, so layered, and so fundamentally disorienting that even the most experienced voice in television cannot find the words. There was a time when marrying someone meant knowing who they were. There was a time when a name on a marriage certificate meant the same thing as the name on a birth certificate. But when Carolyn Massey discovered that the man she had shared a bed with, raised children with, and built a life alongside for 16 years had been operating under a fabricated identity the entire time, she learned a truth that is almost too disturbing to process. Some people do not hide a part of their lives. They hide their entire self. And the person standing next to you can be a complete stranger wearing a costume so convincing that even love cannot see through it. If you believe that every person deserves to know who they are really married to, and that no lie, no matter how elaborate, can survive the light forever, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel right now. What this wife uncovers about her own husband is the most shocking revelation in Family Feud history. And Steve Harvey's response proves that some truths are bigger than any words. ACT 20. CAQR Sissy fathered on 45-400. Carolyn Massey was 43 years old. She was from Augusta, Georgia, a city that sat on the banks of the Savannah River and was known for golf, military families, and the kind of community where your reputation was built across generations, not overnight. Carolyn was the daughter of Franklin and Irene Massey, a career Army officer who had served at Fort Eisenhower for 20 years, and a middle school science teacher who had spent 3 decades teaching 8th graders about the periodic table and the importance of verifiable evidence. Franklin ran the household with military precision. Irene ran her classroom with scientific rigor. Between them, they raised Carolyn and her younger brother, Nathan, with a value system built on 2 pillars: discipline and verification. Franklin said, "Trust but verify." Irene said, "If you cannot prove it, you do not know it." Carolyn absorbed both lessons. She would need them. Carolyn was methodical by nature. She graduated from Augusta University with a degree in information technology and took a job as a systems analyst for the hospital network that served the Fort Eisenhower military community. She spent her days troubleshooting networks, analyzing security vulnerabilities, and maintaining the digital infrastructure that kept medical records safe and accessible. Her job required precision, skepticism, and the ability to identify anomalies in complex systems. She was excellent at it. Her supervisor once said that Carolyn could look at a server log the way a cardiologist looks at an EKG, finding the irregular heartbeat in a sea of normal data. It was the perfect metaphor, because Carolyn would eventually find the irregular heartbeat in her own marriage using the exact same skills. She met the man she knew as David Wells at a church community group when she was 26. David was 29, a calm and articulate man who said he worked as an IT consultant for defense contractors in the Augusta area. He was knowledgeable about technology, which impressed Carolyn. He was polite and respectful to Franklin and Irene, which reassured them. He attended church regularly, volunteered for the community food bank, and presented himself as a man who had grown up in Charleston, South Carolina, earned a computer science degree from a state university, and moved to Augusta for work opportunities near the military installation. Everything about David Wells was plausible. Everything about David Wells made sense. Everything about David Wells was a lie. But Carolyn did not know that yet. Nobody did. David was meticulous in his fabrication. He had documentation. He had stories that held up under casual questioning. He had the easy confidence of a man who had been living inside his constructed identity long enough that it felt natural. Franklin met David and liked him. Irene met David and asked detailed questions about his education and background. David answered them smoothly. Franklin told Carolyn afterward, "He checks out." Irene said, "He seems genuine." Neither of them could have known that the man sitting in their living room had built his entire identity from scratch. They married after 2 years of dating. The ceremony was at the church where they had met. Franklin walked Carolyn down the aisle in his dress uniform. Irene sat in the front row with her hands folded, watching David with the focused attention of a science teacher evaluating a lab experiment. She saw nothing wrong. The experiment appeared to be proceeding normally. All the variables were in the expected range. The hypothesis that this man was who he said he was remained uncontradicted. For 16 years, the marriage functioned. They settled in a house in a quiet Augusta suburb. They had 2 children. Their daughter, Maya, was now 14, a gifted student who loved computer programming and had inherited her mother's analytical mind and her grandfather Franklin's discipline. Their son, Elijah, was 11, outgoing and athletic, the family's emotional center, who could make anyone laugh and who had an instinct for reading people that was advanced for his age. Carolyn continued working at the hospital network. David's IT consulting career appeared to grow steadily, with clients he mentioned by name and projects he described in convincing detail. The first crack appeared 8 months before the Family Feud taping. Carolyn was updating the family's insurance paperwork and needed David's social security number for a form. She had used it before, but when she entered it into the verification system she had access to through her work, the system returned an anomaly. The number was valid, but the name associated with it in the federal database was not David Wells. It was Derek Wayne Calloway. Carolyn stared at the screen for a long time. Then she ran the search again. Same result. Derek Wayne Calloway. She ran a background check using the databases she had access to through her hospital network security clearance. What she found unraveled 16 years of her life in a single evening. The man she knew as David Wells was actually Derek Calloway, born in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He did not have a computer science degree. He had not attended any university. He had a criminal record that included fraud charges in 2 states, both involving the use of fabricated identities to obtain employment and credit. He had changed his name, his background story, and his documented history before moving to Augusta. He had built an entire identity, complete with references, employment history, and educational credentials, that was sophisticated enough to pass casual verification, but that would not survive the kind of deep, system analysis that a hospital IT security specialist was trained to perform. Carolyn did not confront him that night. She did not confront him that month. She spent 8 months in a state of controlled investigation that her mother Irene would later describe as the most disciplined thing she had ever seen a human being do. Carolyn verified every piece of information. She confirmed the real identity. She documented the fabricated one. She mapped the discrepancies between who David claimed to be and who Derek actually was. She built a file that was, by any legal or professional standard, airtight. She told 2 people, Franklin and Irene. She sat at their kitchen table, placed the file in front of them, and watched their faces as they read it. Franklin, the Army officer who had spent 20 years assessing threats, went pale. Irene, the science teacher who had spent 30 years teaching students to verify their hypotheses, pressed her hand to her mouth. The hypothesis had been wrong. The experiment had produced a result that nobody had predicted. The man they had welcomed into their family was not real. The Family Feud appearance was David's idea. He had applied months earlier, seeing it as a fun family activity. The team was David, Carolyn, Franklin, Irene, and Carolyn's coworker and friend Denise, who knew about the investigation and who came to provide support. David packed his bag for Los Angeles with the relaxed confidence of a man who had been performing his identity so long he had forgotten it was a performance. Carolyn packed the file. ACT3. TGC Jala 412 $. The team was matched against the Rivera family from San Antonio, Texas, a warm and boisterous family of 5 led by a retired Army sergeant major and his wife, a detail that Franklin noted with a respectful nod across the stage. The energy in the studio was patriotic and fun. Steve Harvey worked the introductions with his usual warmth. When Steve reached David and Carolyn, David delivered his introduction with the smooth ease of a man who had been introducing himself as someone he was not for over a decade. "Steve, this is my wife, Carolyn. 16 years of marriage. She is an IT specialist at the hospital. Smartest woman I know. I am just lucky she chose me." He smiled. The audience applauded. Carolyn smiled beside him. Franklin and Irene stood in the lineup with expressions that were controlled and unreadable. The expressions of people who were executing a plan and were not going to deviate from it by a single muscle. The game progressed through the first 2 rounds normally. The team won 1 and lost 1. David was charming and gave good answers. Carolyn was precise and measured. The game felt routine. The 3rd round arrived. Steve read the question. "We asked 100 people, what is the biggest lie someone could tell their spouse?" Carolyn was up for the face-off. She hit the buzzer. She looked at Steve Harvey with the steady, diagnostic focus of a systems analyst who had identified the anomaly and was about to report it. "Their real name," Carolyn said. The answer was on the board. Number 4 answer, 11 points. The audience clapped. Steve said, "Good answer." The game continued normally. But something in the way Carolyn said it, the weight behind the words, the eye contact that lasted a fraction too long, registered with Steve on an instinctive level. He filed it the way he filed every micro signal he detected on his stage. The team played the board. Answers came in from around the lineup. Having an affair. Being in debt. A secret child. The board was nearly cleared. 1 answer remained. It cycled back to Carolyn. Carolyn stepped to the podium for the 2nd time. Steve repeated the question. "What is the biggest lie someone could tell their spouse? We need 1 more answer." Carolyn did not look at the board. She turned to face David. And what she said next was not a game answer. It was a detonation that made every previous revelation on the Family Feud stage look like a firecracker next to a bomb. Their entire identity, their name, their past, their education, their criminal record, everything. The biggest lie someone can tell their spouse is who they are. And I know, because the man standing behind me, the man I have been married to for 16 years, the man I know as David Wells, is not David Wells. His real name is Derek Wayne Calloway. He was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He does not have a college degree, and he has fraud convictions in 2 states. I found it 8 months ago through a Social Security verification at my job. I have the documentation. Every piece of it. The studio did not gasp, it seized. 200 people experienced something beyond shock. It was closer to vertigo, the disorienting sensation of the ground shifting beneath your feet. This was not an affair. This was not a financial secret. This was a woman standing on national television telling the world that her husband was not who he said he was. That his name was fake. That his past was fabricated. That the man who had slept in her bed, eaten at her table, and raised her children for 16 years was a constructed character operated by a stranger. Steve Harvey's reaction was captured from multiple angles and would eventually be studied by media analysts as one of the most genuine moments of stunned silence in television history. His card did not drop. His mouth did not open in the familiar comedic gape. Instead, his face went completely still. His eyes widened slowly. His body locked. It was the reaction of a man whose processing capacity had been exceeded, a system overload in human form. For 5 full seconds, Steve Harvey stood at his podium and said nothing. Did nothing. Simply stared at Carolyn with the blank, overwhelmed expression of a person trying to absorb information that did not fit inside any existing framework. David, or Derek, stood in the family lineup. His transformation was unlike anything the studio had seen in any previous confrontation. It was not the crumbling of a man caught in an affair. It was the dismantling of an entire constructed persona. The face the audience had been watching all day, the charming, easy-going IT consultant, dissolved. What emerged underneath was harder to read, more guarded, more still. The performance had ended, and the person behind it was visible for the first time. Franklin stepped forward in the lineup. The retired Army officer's posture had changed from relaxed grandfather to something closer to the bearing he had carried during active service. His jaw was set. His shoulders were squared. His eyes were locked on the man he had welcomed into his family 2 decades ago, and who had turned out to be a fabrication. Irene stood beside Franklin, her hand on his arm, not to restrain him, but to signal that they were doing this together. The science teacher and the army officer, verification and discipline, both confirmed. Steve Harvey finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. I need to stop this game. Right now. Because I do not know what to say, and that has never happened to me before. ACT4ETHUR NROD 1200 1600. Steve pulled his earpiece out and walked to center stage. But he did not launch into a speech. He stood there for several seconds, visibly processing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that was different from every other intervention he had ever made. It carried bewilderment. I have been on this stage for many years. I have heard men confess to affairs. I have heard financial secrets exposed. I have heard family lies unravel in real time. But I have never, in my entire career, heard a wife tell me that her husband is not who he says he is. Not that he cheated. Not that he lied about money. That his name is not his name. That his past is not his past. That the man she married does not exist. I am standing here right now, and I genuinely do not know what to say. Because what Carolyn just described is not infidelity. It is not deception. It is something I do not even have a word for. It is the total fabrication of a human being presented as a husband and father for 16 years. He turned to Carolyn. Carolyn, I need to understand something. You are a systems analyst. You work in IT security. You spend your days identifying anomalies in complex systems. And you found the anomaly in your own marriage through a social security verification. Is that correct? Carolyn nodded. I was updating our insurance paperwork. I entered his social security number into a federal verification system I have access to through my security clearance at the hospital. The name that came back was not David Wells, it was Derek Wayne Calloway. I ran a full background check. The person I found has no college degree, has fraud convictions in North Carolina and Virginia, and has a documented history of using fabricated identities. The man I married does not exist on paper. The man who does exist on paper is someone I have never met. The audience sat in stunned silence. This was not the emotional, cathartic energy of a cheating revelation. This was something colder, more unsettling. The audience was not processing betrayal. They were processing the realization that a person could build a complete false identity, sustain it for over a decade, and embed himself inside a family so thoroughly that a military father, a science teacher, and a trained IT analyst did not detect it until a routine paperwork check produced an anomaly. Steve turned to the man the audience had known as David. I do not know what to call you. And that sentence alone tells you how far outside of normal this is. Are you David Wells or are you Derek Calloway? The man was silent for a long time. The silence was different from the silence of a man caught in an affair. It was the silence of a man whose entire operating system had been exposed and shut down. The character he had been playing had no script for this moment. Finally, he spoke. His voice was stripped of the warmth and charm it had carried all day. What was left was flat, functional, honest for the first time. My name is Derek Calloway. I changed it before I moved to Augusta. I created the David Wells identity because I wanted a clean start. I had made mistakes. Bad ones. I did not want those mistakes to follow me, so I built a new person. And I became that person, for 16 years. I know that sounds impossible, but I lived it every single day. I became David Wells because David Wells was the man I wanted to be. The man who went to church. The man who had a good job. The man who deserved a woman like Carolyn. Derek Calloway was not that man, so I erased him. Steve stared at him. You erased yourself and built a new person. And you married a woman under that new person's name. You had children under that name. You signed a marriage certificate under that name. You let a military father and a science teacher welcome you into their family under a name that is not yours with a past that is not real. For 16 years. That is not a clean start, Derek. That is the most comprehensive lie I have ever heard. Because it was not one lie. It was every lie. Your name was a lie. Your degree was a lie. Your background was a lie. Every introduction you ever made was a lie. Every time someone called you David, they were calling out to a person who does not exist. The audience response was not the thunderous applause that usually followed Steve's speeches. It was a low, sustained murmur mixed with scattered clapping, the sound of people who were too unsettled to cheer but too moved to stay silent. This was not catharsis, this was collective disorientation. Steve turned back to Carolyn. Carolyn, you found this 8 months ago. You have been living with this knowledge for 8 months. You have been sleeping next to a man whose name you know is not real. You have been cooking dinner for a man whose past you know is fabricated. You have been raising children with a man whose identity you know is a construction. How did you do that for 8 months? Carolyn's composure, which had been impenetrable, showed its first fracture. Her eyes filled. I did it because I needed to be sure, Steve. My mother taught me that if you cannot prove it, you do not know it. And I needed to prove it completely before I said it out loud. Because what I was about to say was not that my husband cheated. What I was about to say was that my husband does not exist. That my marriage certificate has a fake name on it. That my children's birth certificates have a fake name on them. That everything, from the first day he sat in my parents' living room to the day I stood on this stage, was built on a foundation that was never real. You cannot say that without being absolutely certain, and I am absolutely certain. She looked at Derek. I loved David Wells. I loved him for 16 years. He was a good father. He was present. He was kind. And none of that was connected to a real person. You gave me a character to love Derek, and I fell for it, not because I am foolish, because you were that convincing. But the convincing is what makes it worse. Because it means that every tender moment, every holiday, every bedtime story you told our children was performed by a man who did not exist. Our children do not just have a father who lied. They have a father who was a lie. The standing ovation that followed was the most complicated one the studio had ever produced. It was not the unified, cathartic release of previous episodes. It was layered with sadness, admiration, confusion, and the specific kind of grief that comes from witnessing something so beyond normal experience that the audience did not fully know how to respond. They stood because Carolyn had earned it. They clapped because she had been brave. But underneath the applause was a deep unease that would stay with many of them long after they left the building. Franklin spoke for the first time. His voice was the steady, authoritative voice of a man who had given orders for 20 years and who was now delivering a verdict. I served this country for 2 decades. I was trained to assess threats and identify hostiles. And this man sat in my living room, ate my wife's cooking, and played with my grandchildren for 16 years, and I did not see it. He was that good. And that is what terrifies me. Not that he fooled my daughter. That he fooled me. A man trained to see through deception was deceived. And the only person who caught it was my daughter, the systems analyst, who found the glitch in the data. Carolyn, I am sorry I did not see it, but I am proud that you did. Steve addressed the camera. His voice was raw and unsteady in a way the audience had never heard. I told you at the beginning that I did not know what to say. I still do not. Not fully, because what I just heard is not something my experience has prepared me for. A man invented himself. He created a name, a history, a career, and a personality, and he used that invention to build a marriage and a family. For 16 years, I have seen lies on this stage, big ones, but they were all lies about what someone did. This is a lie about who someone is, and that is a category of deception that I did not know existed until I stood on this stage tonight and watched a systems analyst dismantle it with a social security number and 8 months of investigation. Carolyn Massey, I do not have a speech for you. I do not have wisdom. I just have respect. Because you discovered that your entire marriage was built on a fabricated identity, and instead of falling apart, you built the case that proved it. Your father is military, your mother is a scientist, and you are the most thorough, most disciplined, and most heartbreakingly brave person I have ever shared this stage with. ACT5ET Legi ACY 1620 outer plus. The game was never completed. Both families received their full prizes and compensation. The Rivera family sergeant major found Carolyn backstage, stood at attention, and saluted her. Mom, in 30 years of service, I never encountered an infiltration that thorough or a counterintelligence operation that effective. What you did took military-grade discipline. Your father trained you well. Franklin, standing nearby, returned the salute. No words were needed between the two soldiers. The gesture said everything. When the episode aired 7 weeks later, it became the most discussed television moment of the entire year, not just on entertainment platforms. On news networks, legal analysis shows, psychology podcasts, and identity fraud prevention forums. The clip was viewed over 160 million times in the first month. But unlike other viral Family Feud moments that were driven by emotional confrontation, this clip was driven by its sheer implausibility. Viewers watched it multiple times not to relive the drama, but to process the concept. A man had fabricated his entire identity and sustained it inside a marriage for 16 years. Legal experts debated whether the marriage was technically valid. Psychologists discussed the concept of identity fraud within intimate relationships. Identity theft prevention organizations used the episode in public awareness campaigns. The story transcended entertainment and entered the realm of social commentary. The phrase, "Who is David Wells?" became a cultural shorthand for any situation in which someone's presented identity turned out to be false. It was used in discussions about online dating, professional fraud, and the general reliability of the identities people present in daily life. A sociologist published a paper titled, "The David Wells Problem," that examined how trust operates in intimate relationships and argued that Carolyn's experience revealed a fundamental vulnerability in human bonding, the assumption that the person we love is who they say they are. The paper was cited in legal proceedings, academic journals, and mainstream media. Carolyn returned to Augusta and filed for annulment rather than divorce, arguing through her attorney that the marriage was invalid because it had been entered into under a fraudulent identity. The legal proceedings were complex and precedent-setting. Her attorney said Carolyn's documentation was the most thorough she had ever seen from an individual, organized with the precision of a federal investigation. The case attracted attention from legal scholars and identity fraud experts nationwide. Derek Calloway did not make a public statement. He was referred to law enforcement by the show's legal team after the taping, and the fraud convictions Carolyn had uncovered were reviewed by authorities in multiple states. People close to the situation said Derek cooperated with the legal process and did not contest the annulment. The characterization of Derek as a person who had wanted a clean start and had chosen fabrication over honest rehabilitation was discussed extensively by psychologists, who noted that while the desire for reinvention was human, the method he chose, building a new identity and using it to enter a marriage, constituted a form of fraud that caused profound harm to the people who loved the person he pretended to be. Irene gave one interview after the episode aired. She sat at her kitchen table in Augusta, surrounded by the science textbooks she had used for 30 years, and spoke with the measured clarity of a woman who had spent her career teaching students the difference between hypothesis and proof. "I taught 8th graders for 30 years that if you cannot prove something, you do not know it. I taught them to verify their results, to check their data, to question their assumptions, and then a man walked into my home and presented a hypothesis that he was David Wells, and I accepted it without sufficient verification. I did not check the data. I did not question the assumptions. I failed my own standard, but my daughter did not fail it. Carolyn ran the verification, she checked the data, she questioned the assumption, and the assumption was wrong. The man was not who he said he was. My daughter caught it, and I could not be prouder of her or more ashamed of myself." Franklin gave a separate interview, sitting on the front porch of their Augusta home in civilian clothes, but with the bearing of a man who would never fully leave the military behind. He said, "I assessed that man as a non-threat. I welcomed him into my family based on that assessment, and my assessment was wrong. In the Army, a wrong assessment can get people killed. In this case, it cost my daughter 16 years of her life. I cannot get those years back for her, but I can tell her what I told every soldier I ever trained. The failure is not in being deceived. The failure would be in not responding once the deception is identified." Carolyn identified it, and she responded with an operational precision that would have made any intelligence officer proud. "My daughter is not a soldier, but she fought the most important battle of her life with the discipline of one." Maya, Carolyn's 14-year-old daughter, the computer programmer who had inherited her mother's analytical mind, processed the revelation in the way that children of systems analysts process things. She asked questions. Detailed, specific, technical questions about how identity fabrication works, how databases verify information, and how her mother had found the discrepancy. Carolyn answered every question honestly and completely, because Irene had taught her that children deserve verified information, not comfortable fictions. Maya was quiet for several days after the conversation. Then she came to Carolyn and said, "Mom, I am going to study cybersecurity, because I want to make sure nobody can do what he did to you to anyone else." Carolyn held her daughter and realized that the most devastating experience of her life had just produced the most meaningful career aspiration she had ever heard. Elijah, the 11-year-old, handled it differently. He did not ask technical questions. He asked one question: "Mom, did Dad love us for real?" Even though he was not real, Carolyn sat with her son for a long time before answering. She said, "The love you felt was real, baby. The breakfast he made you on Saturdays was real. The way he cheered at your games was real. The name was not real. The past was not real. But the mornings and the games and the hugs, I believe those were real, and you get to keep those. Nobody can take the real parts away from you, even when the other parts were not true." Elijah nodded and went back to his room. Carolyn sat in the kitchen alone and cried, because she had just given her son the most honest answer she could manage about the most dishonest situation she could imagine. Steve Harvey spoke about the Massey episode at several events. At a media conference, he gave a speech that was viewed over 60 million times. "I have been in entertainment for over 30 years. I have given thousands of speeches. I have had a comeback for everything. Every awkward moment, every surprising answer, every emotional breakdown. I always have something to say, but on an October evening in 2026, a woman told me that her husband's name was not his name, and for the first time in my career I had nothing. Zero. My mouth was open and my brain was empty, because what she described was beyond my vocabulary. I had words for cheating. I had words for lying. I had words for denial and betrayal and all the things that happen on my stage. But I did not have a word for a man who invents himself and then uses that invention to marry a woman and raise children for 16 years. I still do not have a word for it. If anyone finds one, let me know, because Carolyn Massey deserves a word for what was done to her. And until we find it, the only word I have is brave." 1 year later, Family Feud invited Carolyn back for a special update. She walked onto the stage to a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. She wore a simple gray dress and a silver pendant in the shape of a key, a gift from Maya, who had designed and 3D printed it herself using the coding skills Carolyn had encouraged. The pendant represented, Maya said, the key to the data that had unlocked the truth. Beside Carolyn, in the front row, sat Franklin in a crisp shirt, Irene with a small notebook in her lap because Irene always had a notebook, Maya with her laptop bag because Maya never went anywhere without it, and Elijah, who was wearing a shirt with a periodic table on it that Irene had given him because in the Massey family, science was love and love was verification. Steve hugged Carolyn and held her for a long time. "Carolyn Massey, how are you?" Carolyn smiled, not the controlled smile from a year ago, a real smile, the kind that comes from a woman who has been through the most surreal experience of her life and has found solid ground on the other side. "Steve, I am doing something I could not do for 16 years. I am living a verified life. Every person in my house is who they say they are. Every name on every document is real. My daughter is studying cybersecurity. My son is learning to play guitar, and he is terrible at it and I love every note. My father still calls me every morning at 0600. My mother still makes me cite my sources when I tell her something, and I go to work every day and I protect systems from anomalies. I used to think that was just my job. Now I know it is also my life's work. Finding the anomalies, verifying the data, making sure the system is real." Steve shook his head slowly. "A year ago I stood on this stage and said I did not know what to say. I have had a year to think about it, and here is what I have come up with. Carolyn, you did not just expose a lie. You exposed a category of lie that most people do not know exists. You showed the world that some people do not hide what they do. They hide who they are. And you caught it. Not with emotion. Not with intuition. with a social security number and a verification system and 8 months of the most disciplined investigation I have ever heard of. Your mother taught you that if you cannot prove it, you do not know it. Your father taught you to trust but verify, and you did both. You verified, you proved, and then you stood on my stage, and you reported your findings with the composure of a professional and the courage of a daughter who made 2 very good teachers very, very proud. He looked at the front row. Franklin and Irene Massey, you raised this woman, and the way you raised her, with discipline and verification, and the insistence that proof matters more than assumption, that is what saved her. Your lessons were her tools, and she used them on the hardest puzzle of her life. You should be proud, because the system you built, the one called Carolyn, it works. It caught the anomaly, it reported the finding, and it is still running, stronger than ever. Franklin, in the front row, sat at attention. Irene placed her hand on his arm, and Carolyn stood on the stage where she had, 1 year earlier, destroyed a fabricated identity with facts and composure, and she looked out at a room full of people who were standing for her, clapping for her, and acknowledging that what she had survived was something most people could not imagine, and what she had done about it was something most people could not have managed. The systems analyst from Augusta, Georgia, had found the irregular heartbeat in her own marriage. She had diagnosed the problem, she had documented the evidence, and she had reported the finding on the biggest stage available to her. The system was clean now. The anomaly was removed, and Carolyn Massey, the real Carolyn Massey, the only real person who had ever lived in that marriage, was still running. If this story reminded you that the truth is always worth finding no matter how deeply it is buried, that the skills the people who raised you gave you will save you when you need them most, and that no fabrication, no matter how elaborate, can survive the scrutiny of a person who refuses to accept what they cannot verify, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. We bring you the most incredible and emotional Family Feud moments every single week. Real families, real truth, and the courage to find it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.